welcome and happy new year to everyone, if it's still acceptable to say that in February, but it is the first time that we've joined together, so I think that's allowable. Welcome to our first podcast for the year. As always, our podcasts are a series of conversations with strata experts about how to work with your manager and your committee and your community to help build more effective committees and communities, whilst recognising the challenges you face. The focus of our conversations will be around the contemporary issues and human factors rather than legal requirements, because we're not lawyers. Since our first podcast, we have explored why people volunteer to be on a committee, their experience of joining a committee, and what are the most important steps for a committee to do from day one. And of course, getting the most out of your trusted advisor, your manager. We have also been on a journey exploring how to prepare your building for electric vehicles and the right and the wrong way to go about it. We also looked at emerging issues like airspace developments, the Illume solution for sole share, unlocking sustainable strata, selling off the plan, and increase in fires through personal mobility devices like our bikes and our scooters. And of course, they continue to be emerging issues, and we will, of course, come back to those topics as well. If you'd like to view any of these recordings from our past sessions, they're all available on our website, and Sam might just pop into the chat box the link to that. But if you go to our website, www.strata community, you go to the Owners Corporation info and look for the Owners Vodcast tile, and all of our vodcasts will be there for you to download. Today, we welcome back our regular panel members, Catherine Leeser, give us a wave, Catherine, and David Hamilton to the conversation. Our panel members are lot owners, very involved with their committees and their buildings. Catherine has experience of multi-storey apartment living, many project improvements with a particular passion for sustainability, and a change agent, can I say, as well. And David, also a high-rise dweller, is our EV and building expert and one of the founders of South Bank 3006, the new voice in the South Bank area for residents of South Bank. Welcome to you again, the panel, and thank you for joining us today. In a blink, the holiday season is a distant memory, but I hope you had a wonderful holiday season. Today's conversation is one of those emerging opportunities. We have our special guest, Andrew Coates from Roost. Welcome, Andrew. Give us put your camera on and give us a wave so everybody knows who
Hi,
you
Julie.
are.
Thanks for having me.
Excellent. Great to see you again. Roost is an online platform that aggregates building listings, recent sales, rentals, and OC amenities and data. It is evolving very quickly as the place to seek out information about apartment buildings. Roost is a startup company, and Andrew is the founder, and is providing an opportunity to build an information-rich front door for Australia's 360,000 residential owners corporations, where residents, owners, OCs, and prospective buyers can access useful data and services related to specific apartment buildings and their communities. The question for us, panel, is should we open this door? Currently, owners corporations have no independent means to present and manage data and information for buyers, owners, or the residents that live in the building. Prospective buyers and renters are only told the bare minimum, as I'm sure Catherine is going to say, which varies around the country as well. As a prospective purchaser or renter, you have very little access to information and are only told, as I said, the bare minimum by real estate agents, who also put a disclaimer, you'll note, that says that anything we say can't be relied upon anyway, and or your vendors or your landlords. Committees have no real way of understanding where their building sits when competing with other buildings, no measure of value, increasing or decreasing, not sure at all how it might rate. Little wonder we have disgruntled owners and residents when they move in and find out what they signed up for is not what they wished for. The second question is the current system working? So just sit tight, Andrew. Your turn will come. I'm going to throw to Catherine first because her passion of renovating means that you have been involved in buying and selling or holding a few strata properties. Do you think, has your experience so far been that the system is working?
Yeah, thanks, Julie. And I've bought in multiple states, so it's very interesting to compare what you can and can't find out. So no, I think the short answer is no, it's not working. I think people in their mind have thought of what they're going to move into, and how do they confirm it? So, you know, I got good in New South Wales. There was a pretty advanced system of going and doing strata reports. So I'd actually go to every strata manager's office when I bought a property, and I'd read all the stuff. Now that's very time consuming. It costs money and whatever. You can get reports as well in New South Wales. In WA, they provide the last AGM minutes and the last budget for owners. And most people don't do any more research than look at that. In fact, most people, I wouldn't think that they look at it. But we do know, of course, that there are product review sites and Google Maps ratings and all that stuff out there which can inform a decision. But really, how does a buyer know what they're buying? It's a really, really good question, and it's really hard. Yeah.
It is really hard. And my experience, like you, has been the same, where in different a prospective purchaser, so the time we're making all those informed decisions, the actual door to the documents that you need is closed. You can't actually get that information. Here in Victoria, you have to enter into a contract of sale, then the door opens and you can get a search report. Yeah. So otherwise I've got to rely and go through the vendor to get a search report. Yes. And as you say, I have to then pay independently to get that. And if you're looking at, you know, 25 properties, which you might well be trying to do this investigation, looking for that right one to renovate and, you know, make more sustainable, then it becomes a cost barrier as well. So personally, having, you know, done the same thing, I feel the system's not working in that favourable. It could be more favourable in how we do promote. That's irrespective of putting my strata hat on per se.
Yes.
It is a minefield there.
I think that all buyers, Julie, sorry, I think that all buyers and renters do have some sort of value judgment, but the question is, how do they confirm it?
Yeah.
That's really the hard thing. Yeah.
Yeah. David, I know just from our quick conversation, you're a buyer beware advocate, but going on the personal notice, and I mean, I understand the background for why that is, but just going on for you personally, what was your experience in trying to buy where you're living?
Well, for me, it was a bit easier because I was the developer.
So you knew everything.
but outside of that, right? No, well, I wouldn't even say that I knew. I would say that I knew everything. I think there are, outside of that, obviously, over the years, I've bought and sold multiple properties, right? I've also been like in the investment business, right? We are all investors in things, and people are investing in a property. So you always carry out your due diligence, right? So how the levels of due diligence and how you do it, and who is responsible for providing the information. So in Victoria since somewhere in the 1970s, we've had a requirement on a vendor. So we shifted the onus from the purchaser to the vendor for the disclosure of information. And it is, and it's a fairly wide swag of information that that a prudent vendor provides. That is the Section 32 statement in Victoria. So the question is, who is responsible? And clearly, in terms of, we shifted in Victoria the onus onto the vendor and off the purchaser. So it's a question of how well both of those parties do their work. And we have, you know, in terms of consumer law, you know, since Roman times, you know, there was this statement about, you know, beware of the vipers in the wall, right? So that and consumer law has been founded on sort of that premise. So, and then you have other states like Queensland, you know, people who are purchasers of properties can walk away right up until then the contract goes unconditional, and that is a long period because there's the onus there is on the vendor, right, not on the purchaser, and they can which is a bit like the UK situation, which is an absolute nightmare, where people, you know, get gazumped and other people walk away from contracts. So, you know, this area of law is complex. I personally find the Victorian situation works well, you know, over my years in it. And yes, you have to do your homework. You know, this is not going to the supermarket and buying a can of beans off the shelf. You are making a major investment decision, and you have to do the work. And, you know, there is no way that you can protect from stupidity. Right? That's,
yeah, but interestingly,
my fundamental starting position.
Yeah, relying on the Section 32, I think, is part of the big problem. Not the content of the Section 32, the availability of the Section 32. So my experience when I'm looking at properties is that it's not available. And in fact, an auction was cancelled because the Section 32 wasn't available 24 hours before the auction. Yeah. So given that they start marketing 4 or 5 weeks out from a sale date, the contract of sale doesn't even eventuate until often the last couple of days before the auction. So how can I do my due diligence? I have to rely on something way more than just the Section 32 to do my due diligence. So I think the system is flawed in so many ways.
But Julie, you've got cooling off periods after.
Not at auction, you don't.
But you do have cooling off period, and most departments in this state don't sell at auction. They sell by private treaty, and you've got.
They start out at auction, they haven't sold, and then they go to private treaty.
Well, you know, maybe my experience is limited to high-rise strata, but you know, I don't see a lot of those going at auction. And yes, but if you demand and you want the Section 32, it will get delivered. The Section 32 is a critical document, and it is, you know, it was a really major shift in the law, even though it's been around for a long time. In fact, it's probably been around almost as long as strata titles have in Victoria. So I think that, you know, we need to hear from Andrew, right? Because Andrew is saying that he may be able to provide an information source that fills this gap, and you and I will continue to have a discussion about how you are an informed buyer, which is a separate issue, right? It's a separate issue. Okay.
Yeah.
I'm thrown to you, Andrew, by that statement.
Well, of course, so what we're really talking about is this public information. You know, what is out there publicly and available for us to help inform us about whether it's I'm a renter who's looking to, you know, where am I going to live for the next 12 months, or whether I'm a purchaser. It's about, you know, where can we really get that public information? And this is sort of, you know, I guess we're going to throw to Andrew now and just say, well, how much of that can Roost fill in that gap? I think the follow-on question is, does an owner's corporation have any role in trying to fill that gap? Right? And that is a major question. It is. It's the door. Are we going to open the door?
Well, more to the point, are they assuming liabilities when they do it, and therefore should they do it?
Yeah. Oh, that's a really good setup, and there's a lot of interesting points there. Look, and I'm not proclaiming Roost is very much a work in progress, but we have been battling away at this space for a couple of years, and we've actually learned some really interesting things, because I guess we have built these kind of rough front doors for apartment buildings, and we've done that really just by aggregating basic metadata, right? That there's an apartment building at this address that's got X lots and it was built in this year and it's got an owner's corporation number. So it becomes a place that now is findable. And so the tricky bit here is how do you satisfy all the stakeholders in this ecosystem? Because some of them are quite, some of them are compliance focused, some of them are averse to financial risk. Others are averse to livability risk. And that's a really important point for owner occupiers, where they want to get a handle on, obviously financial risk is important, but it's less about capital growth. It's more around, I want to live in a harmonious community. I want to make sure that that the place is not a madhouse on a Saturday night, those sorts of things. So there's so many data points that you need to satisfy all these different stakeholders. And you're absolutely right about the notion of, to what level should folks who are maybe legally connected to this entity called an owners corporation, what role should they play? You're absolutely right. It's a $60 million question in terms of that. And look, just a bit of background. In the last couple of years as we've operated Roost, we've had a lot of buyers interacting with these building sites. At various stages, we've offered some public information like listing data, for sales information, things like that. Most of that now is now private. So the actual information that we have in a public context is actually quite light. We've also experimented with how can we add value for owners corporations that are not really about buyers, they're about stakeholders in the building. So a really good example of that is, can an owners corp, or can a resident in a building who knows the contact number for emergencies, can they put it somewhere so that other people can find it? In the same way that maybe I might post that in a WhatsApp group, or I might, post it on my own personal website. It's a useful thing. So, there's a whole spectrum of data sources, some of which are much more controversial than others. Right now, we have done some experiments in the last 12 months where we've tried to satisfy informational needs of buyers around data that we do have access to. So a really good example of that is it's very simple things like median values, median value for units in a building, 1, 2, 3 unit median values, median rental yields, and how that compares with other buildings in the same postcode. So I would say that's sort of connected to financial risk, right? It gives you an idea. And in fact, owner occupiers find that some of the median rental much more interesting, and an owner occupier perhaps it's maybe less interesting, but it's still interesting to know whether there's getting to that sort of financial risk. In terms of the other kind of aspect of financial risk when you're buying, you're absolutely right about Victoria. I mean, the fact that there is a thing called the Section 151 and it has to be handed over and it's free, unlike New South Wales where you've got to pay someone or pay for an existing report, it can be expensive. There's still an issue, I think, for some of the more complicated owners corporations working through that Section 32 and zeroing in on the actual information that relates to strata. I've seen 1,000-page plus Section 32s for a one lot apartment in a city, and I'm sure some of you else in the call have seen that. Particularly you, Catherine. I think you've been involved in lots of these. These things are insane. These documents. So yes, there's disclosures, but for an unsophisticated buyer, boy, unless you've got someone who really knows the space and can pore over that and drill down into, well, actually, there's a letter here from, an engineer, and in fact, there could be something going on with this building, and the disclosures related to owners corporation meetings, when you actually read those meetings, they're pretty cagey now. The fact that they know they're going to be socialized and handed over, they don't say a lot in those published minutes. They do not. You will not in Victoria get a really good read on what's actually going on in that building. And often they refer to the really important stuff like the building manager's report, who might be talking about, crazy Airbnb shenanigans that are going on every weekend. That is not going to be in that disclosure. I can tell you now, it just will not be. These guys are smart. They'll refer to another report that the vendor does not have access to. So just stepping back a little bit, thinking about those other sources and what maybe a buyer is trying to do. If they're really motivated and they'll be doing Google searches, they'll be trolling around, they'll probably find legacy listings from other apartments in the buildings from maybe years ago. These things never go away; they're always around. They might find other valuation information for that specific apartment. They might even find, if they're lucky for some of the bigger buildings, there may be some Google reviews floating around, which of course are mostly by Airbnb people who have been in the building and they're complaining about the fact that the sheets weren't washed or something. And then there's no kind of source of truth for information related to these buildings that all stakeholders can benefit from. And I'm not saying Roost is the answer, but this is the whole. And I guess getting back to the point that you made about, well, what is the role of the owners corporation? And I'm not sure what the spectrum of things that an owners corporation would be comfortable and compliantly able to submit and contribute to these sorts of services. But the idea of giving an owners corporation as a formal entity in a building a place where they can provide some data. Maybe they can have some control over information. Maybe that's only available to people who are residents. But the idea that maybe information that can be shared with a potential vendor is valuable. And it might be just basic metadata. It might be the fact that we've got a pool, we've got a gym, we've got a covered, secure lift, really basic stuff. You either do or you don't have those things. They're not necessarily legally problematic. But even finding that, it's still hard. You might find common area amenities in a unit listing description, but often you don't. And that's that's still valuable, and it's not necessarily contentious. Once you start getting through to legal disclosures, though, then you're in a very different world. And right now, for example, the logical place for that to be is the legal stakeholder, the committee themselves, or the delegated responsibilities like the owners corporation manager, and they're very uncomfortable with anything that's in public domain, is not tightly controlled, or is not in their existing ecosystem of kind of closed owner services. So it's a really complicated space, but there are things that you can do, right? And so one of the most basic things that we've been playing with, and it's not currently on our side at the moment, but you can get interesting information, just sort of taxonomy information from listing descriptions, right? So you can determine whether building A has a pool or not by the fact that it's been mentioned in 24 historical listings which are in the public domain. So that's really interesting. There's financial information that is not controversial, although some committees don't like it being in public, which is that a lot was sold last year and it sold for X dollars, or a lot was rented and it was rented for Y dollars. So there's that's a sort of a pretty standard information. Then you get into some more qualitative metrics. So this building has a median yield of X, and that's actually really high performing for this particular suburb. So that's interesting. It's qualitative, but it's based on fact. It's not controversial. It's fact. Might be controversial for the people who are in the buildings that are not performing very well, but that's all a relative thing. I mean, a low value, median value building is probably going to be a high, median yield building, depending on strata and running costs and things like that. So we think those relativities are interesting, but ultimately, I think that there's an opportunity here for those stakeholders, like someone on a committee, to say, well, wouldn't it be good if we could, instead of relying on a website that's just crawled data about whether we have a pool or not? Well, we know we've got a pool. We've got a place now where we can go and tag that, and now we're going to have a bit more control about the factual information around our building. If they want, then they could perhaps extend that a little bit further. Well, here are our rules. Maybe you have to register to see those rules, but they're our rules. They're not the owners corporation manager. They're our rules. If we want to make them available, we can. If we want to make a welcome guide to residents and owners for our building, and we want to host that, well, we could do that. We've got a place now. We can do it. It doesn't cost us anything, and we're now no longer beholden to our owners corporation manager to manage those sorts of things. And then that potentially could extend a little bit further to maybe photos, maybe galleries, maybe images about what's like to live in our building, what does the common areas look like, so there's a spectrum of things. The last bit, though, is the really important legal stuff, and a really good example of that might be, we're an owners corporation and we don't have any active building orders on our building. We're really proud of that. Or we are compliant with emergency ESG requirements, and we're happy to say we check all those boxes, and we're happy to tell a buyer that that's the quick. I ticked that box last year, and no one's ticked it in the last 12 months. A buyer's looked at it and maybe has gone off. So then it gets into your kind of grey area, and we're not quite sure how to manage that. I won't say we've got all the answers, but you know, the sort of stuff that I've been bouncing around, you know, and Julie and I have been talking about this as well, is that there's this sort of no Wikipedia for buildings, and you know, and maybe there should be. Maybe that's a good thing to have that, and you can hang lots of other data sources and maybe more formal data sources to that, and that those stakeholders in the building that are really that are a source of truth or know information and are more than willing to share that could have some control over that in exactly the same way that I can go to my Wikipedia entry and, you know, add a bit of data, and anyone can actually. But, you know, so I, you know, it's a complicated space. The thing that we've learned the last 2 years is there's a black hole for a lot of information related to these buildings and their associated owners corporation, and that puts a lot of different stakeholders at disadvantage. And I think there's an opportunity for someone, whether it's us or not, but someone to solve for that. Certainly there's an opportunity for the industry and all those stakeholders to be thinking about how to solve this problem, because it is a problem for you know, for lots of different reasons.
I think Andrew, you're quite correct that that it does take work, and that there are disparate sources of information, and that there is a need for metrics for people to be able to evaluate. And one of the most stupid metrics that people use is, oh, I'm buying a 2-bedroom apartment for this number of dollars. Whereas the metric should be, I'm buying an apartment of this size, and it's costing me this dollars per square meter, because that's the only metric that matters in terms of, if you want to compare property A with property B, is what am I buying per square meter? Because that's the sort of fundamental measure of valuation. And thus, is it a good, is it value for the dollar? I'm paying $13,000 per square meter, and I'm buying a 1-bedroom apartment with, then you can flash out with this level of services in the building or in the apartment.
Yeah, look, that's right. I mean, that would be a terrific data point to have. I mean, there's certain data points that would be just really, really, you know, valuable. Capital growth is another good one. But you're right, price per square meter. And in fact, I think condo.com, which is a sort of a similar thing in the US, I think they do have very good information on a square meterage, price per square meter. The trouble we've seen is that data is really hard to find. I mean, we're dealing with partners that know the space very well. I haven't seen any public units, and it obviously exists because, you know, it's in the contract of sale and the property dimensions. But it you know, and certainly in the data set that we've got access to create our little kind of internal metrics and relative metrics, no one is able to say, we don't have access to the, you know, the square meterage of every lot in a building. But I agree, that would be a terrific metric, really, really hugely valuable one.
But you can...
Square meters is really hard though, because they don't advertise it all the same way. So if you're looking at the strata plan and you're looking at total square meters versus the internal square meters versus the square meters with the balcony and the internal, all of that's confusing, and it's confusing for buyers and renters as well, but mostly buyers. That whole metric is really difficult, and there's no standardized advertising standard, and there's no way that it has to be presented in any form. And that's one of my biggest problems with David's. David's is a great idea, and I've tried that many, many times to try and work out comparative value, but you're never comparing apples with apples. So it's very hard.
In Victoria now, I've noticed that agents are advertising in the total, and this is the internal. In other words, the balcony is X and the total is Y, and from, you know, X from Y gives you what's the internal. But the balcony, but ironically, that gets to a thing: is a square meter of balcony have the same value as the internal? And really, when you drill down, okay, so a wet area should have a higher valuation than something. But overall, as a rough measure, it gives people an idea. Oh, I'm buying a 1-bedroom apartment. Oh, it's costing me X. Oh, but it's actually costing me $13,000 or $14,000 per square meter. And oh, I could buy a 2-bedroom apartment in this building, and it's only going to cost me $10,000. but the headline price is a different headline price. And I think educating buyers about that, and you can get the actual sale price, at least you can in Victoria, you can get the actual data, becomes public data of the titles, whatever name it's currently got. It's public data after about 3 months after settlement. It becomes public data. So in terms of historical, and there's a lot of work in trying to do that data matching. I agree, and that's Andrew's problem. But that when I'm interested in metrics, I think it's educating buyers, if you're going to be educating buyers, and also vendors, that is a key metric. And real estate agents never talk about that metric. And it's shifting. How do you shift the people to focus on what is it that you're buying? It
is very different depending on whether you're an investor or an owner occupier, though, isn't it? Because there are some other factual things that as a potential owner occupier in particular, where community risk, livability risk is actually much more important. Things like turnover, right? How long? What's the hold time in a building? What's the proportion of renters versus owner occupiers? So there is ways of coming up with other metrics where it's not. Maybe you care less about the price per square metre that you paid. You definitely care with the fact that people are either selling at a loss or there's a high turnover of sales. People, the hold time is low, or the rental turnover is really, really high. And I think so. That doesn't necessarily definitively say that it's a terrible place to live, but it's another potential data point to help you avoid that dreadful mistake that you're an empty nester and you're bought into a 2-bedroom and you're bought into a community that's not very livable.
But Andy, your first point about getting the basic stuff, the basic data points, like does the building have an EV charger? We talked ad nauseum about EV chargers. That's becoming more and more important in a buyer's decision. Some people like pools, some people like gyms. There's all of those kind of factual things. Just getting that source of accurate information is hugely important. Yeah.
It's interesting with things like AI. There are opportunities now with data crawlers and unstructured data, and a good example of unstructured data is like a listing description or data that might be residing inside an owners corporation database, where you can actually come up where the focus is less contentious information, just like that. It has an EV charger, it has a pool, it has a gym, it has a community garden, it has a cinema room, it's bike friendly, it's pet friendly, just those simple things. I agree. They're not very contentious. And in fact, they're the things from our point of view this year, we think that's a good thing for sources of truth inside a building to give them the keys where they can make the call on that. They're checking a box. They're not going to be legally in trouble if they've said that, we don't have a pool. Well, you either do or you don't. Having 2 lifts versus 1 lift, that's useful data, right? If it's a big building and it's got 1 lift and that lifts out every second month, that's a horrible livability risk, right?
Yeah, you're quite right, Andrew. You're quite right on that sort of stuff, and an amount of it agents do promote, right? Because gym, pool, EV, all of those things, there are sell points. Going back to your other metrics, in my experience, the percentage of owners to occupiers is a key metric that people are interested in. And when I look at domain, when I look at domain about a building, they try to give a measure, but their measure is just simply based on their data set is of rental listings in a building. And it's a very, I've never seen it to be terribly accurate. But
it also will exclude Airbnb listings and short stay. That's the other problem, right?
That's right. So I think you're right. There's a requirement, or there's a clear market need for better information about buildings when you're a purchaser. I go back to my earlier point, which is, what role does an owners corporation have as a legal entity in inserting itself into the process. And that to me is a fundamental liability question for an owner's corporation as a legal entity. You know, it's, yes, we can promote a building. We could say, you know, we've got and a lot of buildings do this. They have, you know, little public websites, and they say we've got this, and they have resident areas and stuff like that.
I think Wikipedia is a really good example of a sort of democratization of data sharing. And in fact, for certain categories, Wikipedia is really good. It already has some taxonomy built in. A really good example is a movie, or if you go and find an album, a musical album, you'll find that there's track listing taxonomy, and you can put a track in, and you can put the who produced it, all those data points. They've provided some structure around a certain type of data, which is a record or a band or a film, that enables someone who wants to submit a correction to do it in a sort of structured way. So I think, in answer to your point, I think that the point here is not to restrict the data sharing, and therefore you put the onus on a legal entity to be responsible for it. I think you've got to find some maybe halfway point where, you know, if I'm a resident, I lived there for 5 years, I know exactly what it has, and I should be able to make maybe a submission. I'm maybe not necessarily going to scroll over it and undo everything else, but maybe that's trackable. Maybe I can see who did it and the date, and just like Wikipedia shows the edit history. So, and I'm not saying that's the solution, but I think that the idea of it not being necessarily an onus of someone that in some situations may be uncomfortable with being on the hook for information.
I think that opens up then the flip side of that is people being malicious in their comments, and a lot of that occurs in a lot of review-based activity. So somebody needs to, you need a moderating process and a moderator.
Well, I think that's where it breaks down. And you're absolutely right about rating systems. And we dabbled with one. We explored that last year, and we got rid of it because it's either ridiculously pro, it's an owner, or it's ridiculously negative, and someone's got a grudge. So they're terrible. And Google product reviews have got the same problem. But I think that the idea of bottom-up data that's around a structured format, I think is the right way to approach it. And I could go right now to the Prime Minister of Australia and I could make an edit on their Wikipedia entry. And democratization basically says, well, anyone else who has an interest in that particular data can say that's rubbish and they can change it. So, and I'm not saying that for everything. You wouldn't necessarily want to have the option to say, oh, I know that this building has an active building report or building order, so I'm going to put that in there too. So I think you've got to be really careful about those sorts of things. And that's a really good example of a malicious thing. And it may be true, it may not be, but it's like massively problematic. So I think, but somewhere there's a safe zone of information, and then there's a more problematic, you know, data set. And then ideally in those situations, you really do want to only give that keys for those sorts of information. And maybe it's not public, maybe it's available to someone who maybe buys a report, or and this is where, you know, having the data that's available to an owners corporation, and they're willing to maintain and control that data and update it, but they also get some revenue because a buyer is willing to pay a bit more for that information. It's not coming from the owners corporation manager, it's coming from the owners corporation themselves. I'm not saying it's an easy thing to do, but there is an interest in information about a building that may create value for those sources of truth. And if you can figure that out, then that's a massive goal for the industry. Not easy to do. I'm not saying it is, but if you could get to that point, then suddenly you open up other disclosures. Yes, we do have an emergency maintenance plan. Yes, we have had smoke alarms checked, or whatever it is. That if I buy a $49 report, then the owners corporation themselves are making money. They're selling data. They're controlling that data.
Maybe as a starting point in introducing this into it, you produce the checklist for buyers. Ask these. Here's the questions you should ask.
It's a really good point. And in fact, we have seen, we did get a little bit further along the way here where we talked to a few strata managers and we said, look, when you're approached by a potential buyer, what are the sort of stuff that they want to ask you that's not being satisfied by the real estate agent? And it'll be stuff like, NBN connection, internet speed, and, stuff that's not in the rules.
Livability. It's livability.
It is livability. You're bang on. It's exactly like that. And of course, an owners corporation manager is going to be very uncomfortable making any qualitative statements about that. And in fact, we recommend in our sort of automated follow-up to people who buy our little, modest reports to say, hey, find a person who lives in the building and talk to them. That's, at the open day, you're almost certain to find people who are sticky beaking, nail them to the wall and ask them what's it like on a Saturday night, right? That's the perfect outcome.
Yeah, I think we have to wrap it there, but I think it's a really interesting topic and subject that certainly we could, ventilate even further. I kind of sit across. I think there is definitely a place for something like this. I think also we kept talking about as though it was something for buyers and for residents and blah blah blah. But I'm putting my committee governance hat on, and I'm going, the data that is coming out of this is also going to be something that is going to help a committee understand is the value, just the value of the building, for example, and where it sits in the, the top 20 in the suburb, understanding what that looks like. Is it going up? Is it going down? And how do we sit with our competitors? At the end of the day, each property is competing with the building down the road. And even if you took it at the $1 per square metre and you could get that metric, why is that one worth so much more than ours? That kind of thing. So I think the data in itself would be useful for a committee to use to help in its strategic planning about the direction it needs to go in, how urgently it needs to maybe reposition itself in the sustainability conversation, because as Catherine says, it's the first question everyone's asking, and if it's not even on the agenda, so I do think there's some interesting high-level stuff that could help committees govern better. I think in the question of, if an owners corporation does it, well, I think there is a certain part of the narrative that is the source of truth that should be coming or written by the owners corporation. It benefits the seller because they can just link straight to the blurb instead of relying on the real estate agent making up their own blurb. And I've seen blurbs that sell car parks that don't even exist in the building, or they're common property car parks, but, oh yeah, that's okay, you can use it. It's a visitor's car park. No, you can't. So there is this source of truth is so important, and taking control. I think there is a little bit of element in that, but without going into that, as David said, that whole section 32, that's there for a reason, and all the vendors' requirements. But there's somewhere there is a sort of a niche area. The opportunity, as I said in the question, was, should we open the door and go down it? I also see, as we're seeing with everything else, if we do nothing, someone else is going to fill the space and do it, and it's all going to be done. That when I say we, it's not that, it's just if we, we have an opportunity to get on board and develop a product to meet the needs of the high level, the base level, the democracy, as you say, in terms of doing it. But if we kind of, don't be part of the change or the conversation, then it's all going to develop around us, and we get left with a product that we may not be very happy with, because it might start disclosing all those things that that we thought were, not able to be disclosed. But any final thoughts, panel, before we need to sign off?
I just think, we're probably quite a sophisticated audience having this conversation, but you've got to remember, the average person buying an apartment to live in probably hasn't bought one before. So we've got to really, really make it really easy for those people to make a judgment call on what they're buying. That's what we've got to do.
And also, the benefit hopefully being we've got more informed people coming into the building who are then less angry and disgruntled from day one. that would be my goal.
Well, I think everybody would love that, Julie. I think for people who are moving into a building to live in it, and they've never lived in a communal environment, aka a strata, and they're coming from the burbs, that is a major shift in their life, and they do need tools to help them understand what that shift is about. And just as they need tools in helping them make the buying decision, and they're generally, a lot of them are very sophisticated people, you know, and they know they're making a decision, and they're making this decision to move. That I think, so I think they are a different group to the investor owner, right? So investors, you know, you have to say investors should be a far more sophisticated group, because they're making an investment decision and they're deciding to invest in this asset class as opposed to shares or managed funds or exchange traded futures or whatever, right? So they can, you know, that's where their needs are, again, a different category. But then, you know, you're right. It would be good to have some, you know, ways of getting data about actual buildings, as in the facilities that are in these buildings, you know, and having a checklist that you might ask if you're in that group of want to be an owner occupier. I'm downsizing. They've never heard of having an ESM. They've never heard of, the only thing they ever know about is there are OC fees and they're always too high. Whereas my view is there are OC fees and they're probably not high enough.
Yes, exactly. Look, I'm mindful of time. We're 15 minutes over. I know the time just goes so quickly. Great conversation. Thank you, Andrew, for joining with us and sharing the information about Roost and where it is in the platform, you know, where it is in the market and how it's being used. Thank you, Catherine, for, again, your insights and thoughts. Great to see you again. And David, love your work. It's always good to hear your thoughts around this as well. So thank you also to our audience, and we look forward to chatting with you again in a month's time. Thank you, Sam.
You're welcome, guys. This recording will be available on our website soon enough. Have a great day, everybody.
Bye.